Welcome to my Bard story.
And welcome to another deep dive. Today we're digging into a really a challenging part of Abraham's story, Genesis chapter 20.
Yeah, it's one of those passages. It's got familiar elements, Abraham on the move, God protecting him, but also some moments that make you uncomfortable and some real surprises.
Exactly. We've got our study note here and some other materials too, drawing on what scholars have pointed out about this whole encounter between Abraham and Abimelek, the king of Gerar.
So our goal today is really to get beneath the surface. What are the theological takeaways? What's the historical backdrop? Any clues in the Hebrew? And maybe most importantly, what does this teach us today? For us as believers, maybe especially for those in ministry, what's here about fear, integrity, God's faithfulness, even how God works in unexpected places? Let's get into it, unpacking Genesis 20, verse-by-verse insights.
Okay, let's jump right in at the beginning, verse 1.
All right, Genesis 20, verse 1, reading from the NIV. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived for a while between Kadesh and Shur. Then he stayed in Gerar.
So Abraham's moving again, south from Mamre, near Hebron, where he'd had those big encounters with God. He heads into the Negev.
Which the notes remind us is that dry southern area.
Right. And he's kind of setting up camp in this borderland zone between Kadesh, which is an oasis marking Canaan's southern limit, and Shur, more desert towards Egypt. It literally puts him right on the edge of the promised land, maybe intentionally, maybe just following the grazing.
And then specifically, he ends up in Gerar. And the original language uses this word ger.
Ah, yes, meaning sojourning or living as an alien. It marks him out right away as a foreigner there, a resident alien.
Not a citizen.
Exactly. And that ger status is important because unlike when he went to Egypt back in chapter 12, there's no famine mentioned here pushing him.
So why ger?
Well, the notes suggest possibilities pasture, maybe trade, maybe strategic, given Abimelek's a king. But the key thing is his vulnerability as an alien. He doesn't have the built-in protections. And that vulnerability really sets the stage for what happens next.
Okay, verse 2 then. And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelek, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her.
Deja vu. Right. It feels so familiar. It's the exact same deception Abraham pulled in Egypt. He tells people, or maybe gets Sarah to agree, she's my sister.
And verse 12 later on clarifies it was, well, technically true in a way, a half-truth.
Right.
She was his half-sister. Same father, different mother.
Right. But the intent behind saying it here, totally deceptive regarding her marriage status.
Yeah, absolutely, to hide the fact she's his wife.
And it's driven by fear for his own skin, which he basically admits later. So Abimelek, whose name the notes mention, my father is king, is a pretty standard royal title back then. He takes her. And that verb, took her, lakwa.
It sounds serious.
It often implies, taking someone into the royal household, maybe the harem. That's what the notes suggest for this context.
Now, here's the thing that always gets me. Sarah's age. She's got to be around 89 here, based on earlier chapters.
That's a crucial point. And it's led scholars like Bruce Waltach referencing Hoffmeyer to question if Abimelek's motive was just physical attraction, because in Egypt, her beauty is mentioned. Here, not so much.
So if it wasn't primarily about beauty, what else?
Well, this is where that scholarly insight gets interesting. Maybe it was political. Abraham's a powerful guy, wealthy patriarch. Taking Sarah could have been Abimelek's way of forging an alliance, like a diplomatic marriage, or bringing someone important from Abraham's camp into his court.
Huh. Like a strategic move?
Potentially. The notes suggest the lack of focus on her beauty here supports that possibility. It adds this whole layer of maybe ancient Near Eastern politics to it.
Wow. Still, whatever the motive, it's just tragic, isn't it? Abraham, God's chosen guy, falling back into this same deception, endangering Sarah, the very person God promised the lineage through.
Fear just seems to win out over trust again. It's a stark reminder that, faith isn't always a straight upward line. We can fall back into old patterns.
Very true. Okay, let's read verse 3. But God came to Abimelek in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman."
Bang. God steps in immediately, powerfully. And the notes point out, dreams are often how God speaks to non-Israelites in Genesis. We see it elsewhere.
And the message isn't subtle. You are as good as dead.
Or even more literally, look, you are dying, hineni. Like the judgment is already upon you because of what you did.
And the reason is spelled out. She's a married woman. The Hebrew is really strong. Ula bal, like a woman owned by her husband.
Yes. It underlines how seriously God takes marriage, and the notes stress this. Even though Abimelek didn't know, he acted in ignorance.
Which he says later.
Right. But the act itself, taking another man's wife, was objectively wrong in God's eyes and carried huge consequences. God's not just looking at intent here. He's protecting the marriage, protecting Sarah, protecting his whole plan. His intervention stops things going further, which would have really messed up the promised lineage.
Okay, verse 4. Now Abimelek had not gone near her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation?
So the narrator slips in this crucial detail first. Abimelek had not gone near her, which, as the notes say, is a standard way of saying they hadn't had sexual relations.
That's vital for his defense.
Absolutely. It backs up his claim of innocence, at least in terms of consummating the union, and his response. He recognizes God's authority, calls him Lord, Kinde, and his question, will you destroy an innocent nation, kind of echoes Abraham praying for Sodom, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. He's appealing to God's justice. And he understands his actions could affect everyone, his whole Goi, his nation.
It's a strong plea. He's basically saying, hold on, judge us fairly. We acted based on what we were told. Are you going to punish the innocent here? He's appealing to justice based on his lack of knowledge about her being married.
Let's read his defense in verse 5. Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands.
He puts the blame right where it belongs on Abraham and Sarah's lie. He says, look, they both told me the same story. I acted on their information.
And he uses that really strong legal language, clear conscience, which is literally integrity of heart and clean hands, innocence of hands.
Yeah, the notes point out these are terms asserting he had no malice, no bad intent. He's saying, based on the lie you told me, I acted blamelessly. It's pretty incredible. Here's this, pagan king
Outside the covenant.
appealing to a standard of truth and integrity before God that, frankly, Abraham didn't meet in this situation.
It really turns things on their head. Like Victor Hamilton notes, that contrast seems deliberate.
It's humbling for Abraham, surely.
Okay, verse 6, God's response. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her.
Wow. God actually validates Abimelek's claim. Yes, I know you acted with integrity of heart. That's huge. God sees his heart, knows he was deceived.
But then God reveals something even more amazing.
Right. I have kept you from sinning against me. The Hebrew really emphasizes it. I myself also withheld you. God actively intervened before Abimelek could consummate the union.
Why? Because it would have been a sin against God?
Exactly, because God instituted marriage. So this is just an incredible display of God's providence, isn't it? He's protecting Sarah, protecting the promise, yes, but he's also graciously stopping Abimelech from committing a greater sin, even while Abimelech is still mostly in the dark.
It shows God's mercy reaching out, his active involvement to prevent the worst, even outside the main covenant story.
Absolutely. Divine restraint in action.
Moving to verse 7. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die.
Okay, so God gives the command, return the man's wife, clear, emphasizes her status. And he gives two reasons. First, she is his wife. Second, this is amazing, he is a prophet, not two.
And the notes say this is the first time ever in the Old Testament anyone is explicitly called a nasi, a prophet, and it's Abraham.
Mind-blowing, right? And notice the function tied to it immediately. He will pray for you and you will live.
So the prophet's job here is intercession, standing before God for others, even for this foreign king who's been wronged by the prophet's own actions.
It shows that even after this massive failure, God still honors Abraham's role, his unique connection to God through prayer. But there's also a serious warning. Don't return her, and you and your whole household will die. The Hebrew motamu is emphatic, certain death.
The stakes are incredibly high. God is serious about protecting his chosen family and the marriage bond. Verse 8 shows Abimelech gets the message. Only the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials and told them all that had happened. They were very much afraid.
He doesn't mess around. Early the next morning, urgency. He calls in his officials, his servants, likely his court, the people who help run the kingdom, and he tells them everything.
And their reaction? Fear. Very much afraid.
Which completely contradicts what Abraham assumed back in verse 11, right? Oh, there's no fear of God here. Well, Abimelech and his court are certainly showing fear of this divine power they just encountered.
It's a fear of consequences, sure, but maybe also, as Walton suggests, that basic reverence for divine authority, recognizing God sees and judges.
Yeah, a respect for divine power and ethical oversight.
Okay, verse 9, the confrontation. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done."
Abimelech calls Abraham on the carpet, and his tone sounds like righteous anger mixed with genuine confusion. "What have you done to us?" Notice the plural. It affected everyone. "How did I wrong you? Like, why would you do this to me? I didn't provoke this."
And he accuses Abraham of bringing great guilt, aukla, on him and the kingdom. The notes say that term often referred to really serious offenses in the ancient world, like adultery. Abimelech gets the gravity, the potential for corporate judgment.
And that last line is just searing. "You have done things to me that should never be done." Kasher. It's a powerful ethical rebuke. The outsider is schooling the insider on basic morality here.
Then verse 10, he presses further. And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?"
And he wants the why. What did you see? Like, what threat did you perceive? What was your rationale for pulling such a dangerous stunt? Get to the bottom of it.
Verse 11, Abraham explains. Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife."
And there it is. Fear and prejudice. He assumed there was no fear of God, no basic moral compass, no reverence for divine authority and juror.
And based on that assumption, he figured they'd kill him for Sarah, his own safety first, just like in Egypt.
Exactly. Overriding trust in God's protection, God's promises. It's a really painful admission, isn't it? How fear can just warp your judgment of other people and ignore God's track record.
And we already know his assumption was dead wrong. Abimelech's reaction, God's own words prove it. Fear blinded him.
Totally.
Verse 12, Abraham adds the half-truth defense. "Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife."
Right, the second-barrel justification. Well, technically, he points out the kinship. She was his half-sister. The notes mention this type of marriage might have been okay back then, though forbidden later under Moses.
But, like the notes stress, using that fact while hiding she was his wife, that's still deception. The partial truth served the lie.
Precisely. The biological connection doesn't cancel out the deceptive intent about her marriage status. It's using a fact to mislead, which, as Waltke says, doesn't make Abraham any less responsible for the danger he caused.
Then verse 13 is quite the revelation. "And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother.'"
This is huge. He admits this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment panic in Gerar. It was a pre-planned strategy, a pact he made with Sarah way back when God first called him out of Haran.
Wow. He built the deception into their journey of faith from the start.
Seems like it. And he frames Sarah's agreement as an act of, loyalty or kindness to him. It shows this wasn't an isolated lapse, but a deep-seated pattern rooted in fear. This is just how we operate.
Which, as the notes say, just underlines how persistent his struggle with trusting God for protection really was, despite everything God had done. Sobering. Okay, verse 14. Abimelech's response after the confrontation. "Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him."
Abimelech acts. He returns Sarah, acknowledging her true status as Abraham's wife, fulfilling God's command.
And he gives Abraham all these gifts, livestock, slaves, big gifts.
Yeah, the notes suggest a few reasons. Maybe compensation for the trouble caused, even though it wasn't fully his fault. Maybe a goodwill gesture to make peace. Or maybe, shrewdly, securing the favor of Abraham in that prophetic prayer God mentioned.
It parallels Egypt, where Abraham also got wealthy, but the context feels different. Abimelech seems motivated by fear of God and wanting to make things right.
I think so. He's acting honorably, fearfully, trying to smooth things over with this powerful figure connected to a powerful God.
Verse 15 shows just how far he goes. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Live wherever you like."
Incredible generosity. Basically, my kingdom is open to you. Settle wherever looks good to you. The Hebrew is literally, dwell where it is good in your eyes.
Which is the total opposite of Pharaoh, who kicked Abraham out after the Egypt incident.
Right. Abimelech seems to see Abraham, despite the deception, as someone whose presence, whose God, could be a benefit. He wants him around. He's actively trying to build a positive relationship now.
It completely flips Abraham's initial prejudice about Gerar.
It really does.
Now, verse 16, he addresses Sarah. To Sarah, he said, "I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated."
Notice he speaks to Sarah. The notes highlight this, acknowledging her directly, unlike Pharaoh. He gives money to Abraham, maybe with a bit of irony, calling him your brother. But it's explicitly for Sarah. 1,000 shekels. That's a lot of silver.
And the reason he gives is fascinating. To cover the offense against you, or literally a covering of the eyes through the name.
Yeah. Scholars like Spicer interpret things as more than just cash. It's public vindication. It's money given to restore her reputation, to remove any shame or suspicion from her in the eyes of her household, maybe the whole community, after she'd been taken into the king's house.
So it's like, this payment clears her name publicly, close your eyes to any potential scandal, she's innocent.
Exactly. Walton agrees it's about restoring her honor. Abimelek is being incredibly careful to make things right, not just legally or materially, but socially for Sarah, too, ensuring everyone knows she's vindicated.
He's really thorough. Then verse 17, Abraham does his part. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelek, his wife, and his female slaves, so they could have children again.
Abraham steps up, fulfills that prophetic role God gave him in verse 7. He prays for Abimelek and his household. It shows that connection to God is still active, even after everything.
And God answers directly. He heals them, way pie, specifically restores their fertility, which had apparently been affected.
It shows God's power, his mercy to Abimelek, his response to Abraham's prayer. The notes kind of subtly contrast this with Sarah still being barren right then, reminding us God works on his own schedule, but Abraham's prayer for others is effective.
Yeah, it's a picture of God's grace, still using Abraham as that channel of blessing despite his flaws. And verse 18 wraps it up, explaining the healing. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelek's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah.
This clarifies exactly what the affliction was and who caused it. Notice the narrator uses Yahweh, the covenant name here, linking it directly to God protecting the covenant line through Sarah. God had closed up all the wombs.
So taking Sarah had immediate consequences from God, protecting the promised lineage. And Abraham's prayer reversed that consequence.
Precisely. It was a protective judgment. Taking Abraham's wife brought this divine block. Abraham's prayer brought the release and healing, signifying the crisis was over, mediated through God's chosen, albeit flawed, prophet.
It's such a powerful illustration of God actively managing events, protecting his plan, even amidst human failure. Deep dive into surprising insights. Okay, going verse by verse is insightful, but the study note pulls out some specific scholarly points that honestly can shift how you read this whole story.
Okay.
Let's dig into a few of those aha moments or maybe overlooked details. What perspectives from the scholars really jumped out at you?
Yeah, there are some really fascinating ones. We kind of touched on it, but that whole question about Abimelek's motive for taking Sarah the view from Waltful, citing Hofmeyr, that's a big one. We automatically assume, maybe because of chapter 12.
That it was all about her beauty, like with Pharaoh.
Right. But she's nearly 90, so the suggestion that it might have been primarily a political move, that feels very different.
Thinking of Abraham as this powerful, wealthy leader, and maybe Abimelek wanted an alliance, so taking Sarah was like securing a treaty or bringing a key person into his sphere.
Exactly. Like a diplomatic marriage, or incorporating someone important from Abraham's group. It fits the ancient Near Eastern context of powerful nomadic groups interacting with city-states. The notes point out the lack of emphasis on her beauty here, unlike in chapter 12, which could support this reading.
That really changes how you see Abimelek. Not just acting on impulse, but maybe making a calculated, strategic, if still wrong, political move.
It adds a whole layer of complexity. Doesn't excuse it, but reframes it. Another big one is Abraham's justification in verse 11. There's no fear of God here.
His prejudiced assumption about Gerar.
Yes. And scholars like Walton and Sarna emphasize that fear of God here doesn't necessarily mean they worshipped Yahweh. It's more about a basic moral compass, a respect for divine authority that underpins social ethics.
And the story proves Abraham wrong. Abimelek does fear God, reacts immediately to the dream, appeals to justice.
Totally. It shows Abraham's fear led him to misjudge a whole group of people. And the notes really use this to challenge us, right? Not to make those same kinds of dismissive judgments about people or cultures outside our own faith bubble, assuming they have no moral sense or awareness of God.
That's a really practical point. God interacts with everyone.
Then there's the significance of Abraham being called a prophet for the first time in verse 7.
Right. Westerman and Von Rad highlight that. First time.
And importantly, as the notes stress, his main prophetic action in this story is prayer. Intercession for Abimelek in verse 17.
So it broadens our view of prophet,
Mhm.
not just speaking for God, but also speaking to God for others. Walden and Kidner point that out too.
Yeah, it shows this crucial intercessory role. And the amazing thing is he steps into this role right after his big failure. It screams God's grace, doesn't it? God still uses him, flaws and all, as his authorized intercessor. His prayer works, validating the title.
Definitely grace. Okay, one more, that phrase for the silver Abimelech gives Sarah in verse 16. Sutra your name.
Ah, yes, the covering of the eyes.
Translated like cover the offense, but scholars like Spicer suggest it's more specific.
Yeah, like public vindication. It wasn't just hush money. It was a specific payment to publicly restore Sarah's honor, clear her name, stop any gossip or suspicion after she'd been in his household. It symbolically covers the eyes of the community to any potential scandal.
Wow. So Abimelech is being incredibly culturally sensitive and thorough in making amends, ensuring her reputation is spotless.
It really underscores his desire to fix things completely, addressing the social damage caused by Abraham's lie. These details really add surprising depth, core teachings, and ministry reminders.
So when we pull all this together, the story, the language, the scholarship, what are the core lessons, the really vital reminders for us today, especially thinking about those of us in ministry? What does Genesis 20 press upon us? What stands out from the notes here?
Well, one huge thing highlighted by folks like Waldke and Baldwin is just how persistent fear can be and how even great people of faith can repeat failures. Abraham, after all God had done, falls back into the exact same trap as chapter 12.
It's sobering, really sobering. It tells you spiritual maturity doesn't grant immunity to old weaknesses, does it? Especially fear. Fear for our security, our reputation, our ministry's future. It can trip any of us up.
Exactly. We can't get complacent. It's a call to stay humble, vigilant, constantly aware of our need for God's grace. And for leaders, being honest about that struggle, not pretending we're above it, is actually powerful. It points people back to depending on God, not on us.
And tied right into that is the absolute need to trust God's provision and protection, even when fear is screaming at us. Kenneth Matthews' point in the notes.
Abraham's lie came directly from not trusting God. He focused on the threat, they'll kill me, and got blind to God's promises, God's power, God's presence.
It really forces you to ask, where is my trust when things feel shaky or threatening? Is it in my own cleverness, my own plans, trying to control the outcome? Or is it truly anchored in God's faithfulness?
Real peace comes from that anchor, not from manipulation. And in ministry, modeling that trust, showing people how to live by faith in the face of fear, that's maybe one of the most important things we do.
Definitely. Then there's the whole theme of integrity and truthfulness. Abimelech's confrontation really brings this home.
Yeah, as Victor Hamilton points out, the outsider calls out the insider's deception. Abraham's half-truth was still effectively a lie, and it caused real harm, real danger.
It's such a vital reminder for us. Even small compromises, little dishonesties, maybe things we try to justify, they can have big ripple effects. They erode trust, they damage our witness.
Especially in ministry where trust is everything. We're called to reflect God's character, and God is truth. So maintaining integrity, even when it feels costly or difficult, has to be paramount.
Absolutely. And one last thing the notes bring out, referencing scholars like Freeheim and Sarna, is that point about God working outside the expected lines and the reality of universal moral awareness.
God talking directly to Abimelech, confirming his integrity. It's significant. It shows God is active beyond just Abraham's family or, the church today. And Abimelech's reaction shows there's a basic sense of right and wrong, a fear of God in that broader sense that exists universally.
It stops us from maybe too quickly writing off people outside the faith, like Abraham did with Gur. It encourages us to see God's common grace, his work in people's consciences.
Right. And for ministry, that's key for how we engage with the world. It reminds us the Holy Spirit might be preparing hearts in ways we don't see. We can find common ground on basic moral truths, which can be a bridge to deeper conversations about faith in Christ. We shouldn't assume, like Abraham, that there's no fear of God out there.
Folding onto the core.
Okay, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 20, what are the main things, the absolute core takeaways we really need to hold on to from this chapter?
I think for me, it just keeps coming back to that stark contrast. You've got human failure, even repeated failure in someone like Abraham, driven by fear. But then you have God's relentless faithfulness, his sovereign protection. Abraham messes up badly. God steps in, stops the worst, fixes the situation, and then still uses Abraham in his prophetic role through grace. It's just this incredible picture of God's grace overlaying human weakness.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about Abimelech, this pagan king who in this story at least, shows more integrity and responsiveness to God than the patriarch does. God acknowledges his righteousness in this specific situation. It's humbling. It reminds you God isn't confined to our boxes. He honors integrity. And sometimes those outsiders can teach us a lot about ourselves.
And how God weaves even these messy, sin-scarred situations into his larger purpose. He reveals his justice, his mercy, his power to restrain and heal, his absolute commitment to his plan, and his willingness to restore and use his people even after they've failed him.
What does this mean for you?
So as you've listened and thought about Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelek, maybe thinking about areas in your own life, your own ministry, where fear might tempt you to cut corners, or maybe where you've been tempted to judge others quickly. What does Abimelek's surprising integrity and God's persistent grace towards Abraham stir up in you? What might you need to reevaluate in your own walk with God, or how you engage with the world?
That's the question, isn't it? This story really pushes us to look at those hidden corners where fear might still be calling the shots instead of faith. Where are we relying on our own half-truths or clever maneuvers rather than on the transparent integrity that comes from really trusting God's got this? For leaders, are we truly modeling that reliance when anxiety hits? And are we maybe too quick to dismiss those who don't believe like us, forgetting God's common grace, forgetting that sense of justice he's planted in people? How can we step into that role Abraham eventually played, praying for others, being channels of grace, even when we know we're flawed and have needed grace ourselves? It really calls for that daily, humble dependence on God, trusting him with our safety, our reputation, and trying to see others and the world without the distortion of fear and prejudice.